Blood and Salt by Liggett. Read to you by me. Chapter 2. Scar Tissue. You'd never know it by the caustic scent in her studio, but my mother made some of the most exquisite perfumes in the world. She had an elite clientele willing to pay a small fortune for fragrances that were truly unique. She worked on other things too, sacred things. The smell of sulfur and putrid brine wafted through the air, remnants of her last alliance with the unknown. Our apartment had a minimalistic, modern feel, while my mother's studio was warm and cluttered, like stepping back in time, a private oasis in the middle of New York City. Exposed brick walls were studded with arched windows, fragrant plants and vines grew in every nook and cranny. Still, my mom's favorite part of the house was a small stretch of grass in the center of the room. It wasn't just any grass. The seeds came from Quivira. She seemed truly at home here in the studio, standing among hundreds of mismatched bottles stacking on graduated shelves. As a kid, I loved watching her work. I was always fascinated by the layer of fine gold dust that clung to her fingertips as she traced symbols in the air. She had her own language for formulas, a mix of ancient alchemy symbols and Ch.2, the language of the Native American tribe who first inhabited Quivira. Supposedly, it was passed from generation to generation of working women, but my mother never wanted me to learn. She didn't want us to be a part of that world, even if it was all over her head. It was still kind of beautiful, like a twisted fairy tale. I spotted the sharpened bison bow needle on the edge of her desk. Do I smell wild jasmine? I asked, trying to distract myself from what was about to happen. A smile eased across her lips as she placed 2 drops of clear liquid into a narrow vial. You're close. It's blue lotus. She stood on bare tiptoes to reach a bottle on the top shelf. She only wore shoes if she absolutely had to, another holdover from her upbringing. My mother glanced at me appraisingly. Your nose may be improving. Any chance it's rubbed off on your brother? Highly unlikely, I said. To Rhys, everything smelled like Play-Doh, cinnamon, or feet. You know, it's rude to talk about people in front of them, my brother called out as he meted around the studio, squeezing through the apothecary shelves with his hands held high in the air, trying not to touch anything. He thought alchemy was just a fancy word for witchcraft, but my mom always said it was about transformation. It could be herbs, metals, chemicals, or even the soul. I wish you'd teach me, I said as I watched her work. You know everything you need to know, as she replied, as she pulled from bottles from the shelves. Just what anyone could pick up from a textbook. I removed the glass stopper to take a whiff, sharp and metallic. She smiled, but there was a twinge of sadness in her eyes. You have your whole life ahead of you. A beautiful life. Free of all this, she said, as she took bottles away from me. You are not responsible for the sins of your ancestors. Rhys made a throttling motion behind her. He hated when she talked in riddles. I know what you're doing, Rhys, my mother said without turning around. Busted, I mouthed with a grin. A deep flush reached all the way to the tips of his ears before he sulked off to look out the windows. You know you have Katya's eyes, my mother said to me, the dead girl. Wait, did Katya look exactly like me? No. She gave me a puzzled look. There's a family resemblance, though. Why would you ask that? Just curious. I feigned interest in an old marble pestle. Katya Larkin, my great whatever grandmother, was a powerful alchemist in the 1500s. So powerful that the King of England, the King of Spain, and the Catholic Church all wanted to burn her at the stake. Apparently, she could turn common metals into gold and heal the sick. But the real kicker, they said she was immortal. How she ended up in the middle of Kansas in 1541 is a sordid tale. Katya and her 4 children escaped to the New World with a conquistador, Cornando. In exchange for their safe passage to Quivira, Katya agreed to make Cornando her immortal mate. But of course she'd fallen madly in love with one of his soldiers, Alonso Mendoza. Shit hit the fan when Katya tried to go behind Corando's back and make Alonzo her mortal mate instead of Corando. Legend has it that Corando killed Alonzo and forced Katya to bloodbind to him. The only way to break the bond was to find vessels, whatever the hell that meant, so she could be reunited with her one true love. It was all very Days of Our Lives, and my mother believed every word of it. "Are you ready?" she asked, holding the elixir in one hand, the bone needle in the other. I nodded and walked to the center of the room, to the raised bed of grass. Rhys settled next to me. "You don't have to do this." "Don't worry," I shooed him away. "I'll be fine." Rhys perched himself on the far edge of the grass, looking at the wall so he wouldn't pass out. He wanted to be there for me, but he didn't do well with blood. I removed my blouse and lay down, feeling the crush of soft blades against my back. My mother kneeled beside me, pushing aside the strap to my camisole. She traced the symbol with her fingertip directly below my collarbone. "Today I will give you a circle with a dot in the center, closest to your heart." "The symbol for golden sun," I said, in a jittering breath. "Someone's been paying attention," she said, as she leaned over me, her chestnut hair spilling onto her shoulders, obscuring her face. She breathed slow and deep and began to meditate or pray or whatever it is she did. Sometimes Rhys and I would come home from school to find her that way. We'd wonder if she'd been in that state all day. She always said she was practicing, using the energy of her surroundings to hang onto her soul as the world collapsed around her. Needless to say, we didn't ask about it often. Rhys tapped a shiny loaf on the tiles. "Can we just get this over with?" She dipped the fine needle bone to my murky tincture. "Urakawa," she whispered. "This means let go and let yourself fall." Concentrating on the narrow shaft of sunlight streaming in through the open skylight, I inhaled deeply as she pressed the needle into my skin. It stung. You'd think after 17 years I'd be used to it, but it still hurt like the very first time. There was an ancient method of tattooing, the ink made from rare essence and metals, part of a series of archaic protection spells that left no visible mark after the pinprick seal. The tattoos covered my entire body now. I don't know if they did any good, but it made Mom feel like she was helping me. I'd trade a little pain for her peace of mind. As she held my shoulder down, I felt my mother's scar tissue pulsing against my skin. "A dead girl has a scar just like yours," I said. "It's an honor." She eased her hand away, closing it into a fist. "She must have chosen to walk the corn." "Here we go." Rhys shook his head. We'd heard these stories a million times, but unlike Rhys, I never tired of them. It's a tradition in Quivira," my mother continued, her features relaxing, her eyes taking on a dreamy quality. "The chosen couple walks on the corn on the summer solstice. That's when Katya tests our blood, searching for the vessels. Nearly 17 years ago, I walked the corn with your father, Thomas. But he didn't make it out of the corn," I said as I tore my eyes away from the patch of blue sky to study her face. "No, we were separated," she answered in a quiet resignation, pausing to admire her work on the outer rim of the circle. "But Katya led me out of the corn and allowed me to leave Quivira to raise my children." Rhys hunched over, resting his elbows on his knees. I knew it was killing him to not say anything. He thought our family history was a crock of shit. "Katya didn't get that opportunity," my mother said after a series of quick jabs with the needle. "Corando killed her only daughter. According to Mom, Corando was desperate to stop Katya from finding her vessel. When he learned of her plans, he vowed to wipe out our entire bloodline." "Why did he hate Katya so much?" I asked. "Just because she didn't want him?" She paused, the needle hovering above my skin. "Love, hate, sometimes it's a fine line. Falling in love with Alonzo was Katya's undoing. The Larkin women fall too hard, too fast, and too fierce." "I'll never fall in love," I exhaled with a tremulous breath. "Sweet ass," she looked down at me tenderly, stroking my cheek. "When you fall in love, You will carve out your heart and throw it into the deepest ocean. You will be all in blood and salt. Something about her words felt wrong, like putting pressure on a deep bruise. She dipped the needle into the vial and started on the dot in the center of the circle. To an outsider, Quivira looks like nothing more than unkept fields, but really it's a utopia, totally cut off from the world. Katya plays a protection spell over Quivira to keep it that way. It's beautiful. It's a cult, Rhys said. The land itself is sacred, my mother said defensively. Descendants of families who came to Quivira with Katya remain to this day. The Mendozas, the Grimsbys, the Hanrettys, even Corando's children stayed behind, generation after generation, waiting. Her voice trailed off. What are they waiting for? I asked, taken aback by her strange tone. A bird soared over our skylight, sending a shadow across her face. Crow, she whispered as she dug the bone needle into my flesh. And so it shall be. I clutched the grass in my fingers. Mom, I winced, blood trickling down my chest, seeping into my camisole. Her eyes went wide and dark, like the Atlantic after a storm. The day has come. Can you feel it? Can you feel her presence? What are you talking about? You're hurting me. I held her wrist. She blinked a few times and then gasped. I'm so sorry. As she pulled out the needle, she accidentally stabbed her thumb. Pressing her hand against my wound, she tried to slow the bleeding. Is something wrong? Rise up to his feet. Eyes still trained on the wall in front of him. Everything's fine, I assured him as Mom scrambled for the first aid kit. I don't know what came over me, she whispered as she bandaged the wound. I felt uneasy as I put my blouse back on. She'd never been that careless with the needle before. The bird passing overhead had definitely spooked her. In alchemy, the crow had many meanings, including being the harbinger of death. I wanted to ask her about it, but not in front of Rhys. He'd had enough for one day. You can look now, I announced as I stepped off the grass onto the terracotta floor. Rhys searched my face for signs of trouble. He seemed satisfied until he caught his sight of a piece of bloody gauze resting on the grass. His face turned an unnatural shade of gray. We're going to be late, he said as he headed for the stairs. I started to follow, but my mom pulled me in for an unexpected hug. Everything you'll ever need is inside you. Ouch! I whispered in her ear. Oh, she laughed as she put it away, taking the pressure off my chest. I love you both very much. We know. I smiled and squeezed her hand before I went downstairs. Rhys was holding the elevator, straightening his tie in the mirror. I slung my bag over my shoulder and stepped in next to him. You're the only person I know who actually likes his school uniform, I said in an attempt to lighten the mood. He brushed his dark blonde bangs from his forehead. Yeah, Ash. We know. You're so cool. As the elevator door closed, I caught a glimpse of the chandelier. I could almost feel the rope scraping against my ankles. Feel the slit in the palm of my hand, dripping blood. What if the dead girl was me?